Hey guys, and welcome back to Red Coat Histories. In today's 5-minute history, we're looking at the Battle of Ypres, the Third Battle of Ypres, aka the Battle of Passchendaele. It's still remembered today as one of the most horrific battles of all time. The mud, the blood, the senseless slaughter. But what's the truth behind that? Was it such a disastrous battle? Or did it actually help to win the war? So before we begin, I just want to apologise for my terrible pronunciation. I don't speak French or Flemish, and I don't know how to say some of the names correctly, so apologies for that. Secondly, I want to say thanks to Nick Lloyd and his book about Passchendaele, A New History, which I recently read and was the inspiration and also the main source for this video. So the Battle of Passchendaele, or Third Ypres, was fought between the 31st of July and the 10th of November 1917. There were some further attacks into December, but the main battle, the bit we're focusing on, what we're talking about, ended on the 10th of November. The weather was awful, the fighting was intense, and there was over 500 casualties during the course of that battle. It was pretty horrific. So the British Army, well, British and Empire Army we should say, of November 1917 was a tough force. These guys had learned their lessons on the Somme at Arras. They understood fire and manoeuvre. They understood flanking attacks. They were well armed, well equipped. You know, this wasn't a sort of army of donkeys. These were tough guys who could match the Germans man for man. So the original reason for the offensive, why they decided to launch it, was to expand the Ypres salient where the British had been penned in since 1914, to capture the Passchendaele Ridge and its views, and also to capture the important railway lines beyond. This was all with the intention of being able to launch an amphibious assault along the Belgium coast. So Hubert Gough and his Fifth Army were chosen by Field Marshal Haig to lead the attack. Gough was one of Haig's protégés. He was a real thruster, and he thought he was the man to really break through and finally end the sort of trench warfare that had kept them penned in for so long. So the first stage of the battle is now known as the Battle of Pilckem Ridge, and there was a furious bombardment, 2 weeks long, the longest preliminary bombardment the British had launched in the war. But while it was a terrifying show of force, it didn't achieve what the British generals had hoped. It didn't destroy the Germans, it was spread over too large an area, and actually it churned up the ground that badly and destroyed the sort of very delicate drainage system in the region, just turning the battlefield into a muddy morass. The British needed good weather and firm ground for this attack to work, and they didn't really get either of those things. So it was a misty and cold morning when the attack went in on the 31st of July. The Royal Flying Corps weren't able to help. There was confusion, and inevitably the attack began to break down. So the main attack was led by 2nd Corps of the 5th Army, who were attacking the Gellerfeld Plateau. There were some initial successes. Prisoners were taken. They did advance into the enemy's trench system. But inevitably, as always, the Germans counterattacked and started to retake a lot of what they'd lost. By the afternoon, heavy rain began, and any chance of a breakthrough, at least on that day, was already gone. That first phase of the battle saw mixed success, but generally there was no big breakthrough, things weren't looking good. British casualties were around 32,000, which at the time weren't considered too bad. But I mean, imagine now if British troops suffered 32,000 casualties over the space of a few days. Pretty horrific. So the rain continued, and there was a bit of a pause in the fighting until the 10th of August, when the 2nd Corps attacked again, the 18th and 25th Divisions. These guys had already been in the front for a week. They were wet, they were tired, they were exhausted. They couldn't bring enough guns up to support the attack, and it was generally a disaster. They did manage to take the village of Westhoek, but other than that, they weren't able to break through and get very far. The next stage of the battle was fought between the 16th and the 18th of August, and is now known as the Battle of Langemarck. The plan was for the 2nd and the 19th Corps to break through to the German third line. That was between Polygon Wood and Zonnebeke Spur, an advance of about 1,500 yards. But yet again, the ground was too difficult, the mud was too deep, and the tanks couldn't get through to support the infantry. The assault was a disaster. Cyril Falls, the historian of the 36th Ulster Division, said, with great understatement, "The story of the attack, alas, is not a long one. The Germans were dug in, it rained again, and the troops were massacred." After a series of smaller attacks, even Haig realised the breakthrough wasn't going to happen. Something needed to change. So the attacking was paused, and the main shift of the offensive was moved to General Plumer and his Second Army, which had been so successful at Messines. Plumer was what was known as a bite and hold guy. He didn't believe in big breakthroughs. He knew the Western Front was all about claiming small bits of land and then defending against the inevitable German counterattacks. He was all about logistics, he was all about artillery and fire support. In his favour, the weather began to improve, and also the Australians were brought in as his spearhead troops. As you'll see throughout the First World War, especially in the later years, the Australians and Canadians often became the shock troops of any British offensive. Also in Plumer's favour, the German troops along the Gelufeld Plateau were overstretched and they were also tired. On the 20th of September, the Second Army's attacks began. This phase of the battle became known as the Battle of Menin Road. It was a textbook display of a creeping barrage, with the artillery landing just ahead of the advancing infantry, putting up a wall of iron in front of them. The British and Anzac troops captured most of their objectives that day. It was a big success. And even the German counterattacks that came in the afternoon were repulsed with heavy casualties. An impressive VC was won on this day by Sergeant William Berman. When the advance of his company was held up by a machine gun at point-blank range, Sergeant Berman shouted to the men next to him to wait a few minutes, and going forward to what seemed certain death, killed the enemy gunner and carried the gun to the company's objective, where he used it with great effect. 15 minutes later, it was seen that about 40 of the enemy were enfilading the battalion on the right. Sergeant Berman and 2 others ran and got behind them, killing 6 and capturing 2 officers and 29 other ranks. Of the 61 Victoria Crosses that were awarded for conspicuous gallantry during the battle, more than 40 were given to individual attacks on enemy pillboxes or machine gun nests. Plumer's successes now were becoming worrying for the Germans. Not only was he taking ground, they weren't able to recapture it, and that was a situation they weren't used to. Their whole defensive system was built around defence in depth. They would let the British wear themselves out, capturing the first line or 2 of trenches, knowing that they would counterattack in force and retake them at will. That wasn't happening anymore, and the Germans were getting nervous. Next up was the Battle of Polygon Wood, which launched on the 26th of September. The fighting was similar to that of the 20th. Creeping barrage, bite and hold, German counterattacks repulsed. Again, it was a success. The Germans pulled back now to Brutiende Ridge, and that was attacked on the 4th of October, again with staggeringly successful results. There was no bombardment before the attack. They wanted to keep it as a surprise, and it certainly was, because at the same time the Germans had been planning their own attack, and both the Australians and the Germans met in no man's land. There was a furious fight and the Germans were sent running. The battle was quickly won. The British had advanced another 1,200 yards, and Plumer had proved once again how good and important his bite and hold tactics were. The minute though, the weather was still on his side. That wasn't to last. As the weather changed, common sense might have told the British and Field Marshal Haig that now was the time to put a pause, or at least probably end the offensive right there. They'd made some good gains. But Haig wanted to justify the whole offensive by finally capturing that Passchendaele ridge, the village at the top of that ridge. And he insisted that Plumer keep pushing, despite the change in weather. As the weather got worse and worse, not only was it horrific for the men in the trenches and, almost impossible to advance through deep, deep mud, but also the guns couldn't come up to support. You couldn't push heavy guns through that. And when you could get them into position, they would fire a couple of rounds and then their accuracy would be completely off because they didn't have a solid firing platform. The gun would wobble, the shell would go completely off target. So things inevitably were going to be difficult for that final push to Passchendaele. Not only that, but the Germans were well prepared. Thick belts of barbed wire and well dug in machine guns covered the ridge. Flush with success from Brutiende, the British rushed their attack on the 9th of October towards Passchendaele. Guns got jammed in the mud, the men got stuck and they got slaughtered. It was an absolute disaster. On the 12th of October, the British attacked again and failed again. They suffered over 13,000 casualties, including nearly 3,000 New Zealanders, which for such a small force of one division was a pretty horrific number. Even Haig again realised at this point that a breakthrough was unlikely and told them to pause again until the weather got better. was now the trusty Canadian Corps was brought forward. These were arguably the best troops in the British and Empire Army, and it was their turn to try and secure the village under their brilliant leader, General Currie. The first stage of the assault began on the morning of the 26th of October. It was slow progress, and the further they advanced, the more vulnerable they became to German artillery and machine gun fire. On the 30th, they attacked again and doggedly fought their way forward, bit by bit, laying the groundwork for the eventual capture of the village. After a short pause, they attacked again, and on the 6th of November, they finally captured Passchendaele village. It was an incredible feat, given the deep mud, the terrible weather, and the poor logistical chain behind them. The battle was now as good as over. Okay, so it was a pretty horrific battle. No one can claim that it was a great British victory. But I think it achieved more than most people give it credit for. For a start, it kept the Germans on the back foot. At a time when our French allies were falling apart, the mutinies of 1917 had almost destroyed them as an offensive force. And we couldn't allow the Germans the breathing space to put the French army to the test. So that was important. Also, what we did achieve as well, we were able to practice the tactics that allowed us to win the war in 1918. You know, we mastered a lot of things. We learned a lot from that battle. At a high price, yes, but I think it was important in how the British Army evolved during the First World War. Anyway, if you liked that video, please do like and subscribe. There'll be more coming soon. I'm working on one about the Jameson raid. I still want to do one on Gallipoli and one on the last 100 days of 1918, the end of the war. So do subscribe and comment below. Sorry for any mistakes, purely mine. And I'll try and do better next time. All right, cheers guys, bye-bye.